Think your daily life is tough? Trust me, you wouldn't last a full sunrise to sunset cycle in the Middle Ages. We like to imagine ourselves as resilient, adaptable, capable human beings, but the truth is brutal. Modern conveniences have turned us into delicate little marshmallows compared to what people back then faced. Not yearly, not monthly, not weekly, daily. And because everybody romanticizes medieval life like it was some fairy tale era of knights, minstrel songs, and cozy hearths, let's rip that fantasy wide open and step straight into what their world was actually like. And I promise you, by the end of this, you'll thank your Wi-Fi router for existing. Let's start with the part that hits closest to home: food. You know, the thing we complain about if DoorDash takes more than 35 minutes. Medieval food, the stomach nightmare. Hollywood loves showing enormous feast tables with golden turkey legs, shiny grapes, overflowing goblets. But that was the 1% lifestyle. Your medieval average Joe wasn't sitting in Hogwarts dining hall. The regular person's daily meals could be described with one word: despair. Most peasants survived on something called pottage. If you're imagining soup, stop. It wasn't soup. It was more like whatever mush happens when sadness, leftover vegetables, and hopelessness are boiled together for so long that even the pot starts giving up. Families would keep the stew simmering for days, sometimes weeks, adding new ingredients when they had them. New ingredients meaning a cabbage leaf, a root they found, some barley, maybe a dead insect or three who fell in by accident. Their bread wasn't any better. Imagine bread so dense that slicing it feels like a workout and chewing it feels like gravel training. And that wasn't a metaphor. Actual stone fragments from grinding wheels would end up inside the flour. Medieval dentists didn't pull teeth for fun. The bread did most of the damage. Now here's a medieval fun fact that is absolutely not fun. Much of their rye bread was contaminated with ergot, a fungus that can cause hallucinations, burning limbs, spasms, and sometimes death. Entire communities would trip simultaneously, and suddenly everyone believed the woman across the road was flying on a broomstick. The real witch was the baker who didn't clean his millstone. Meat? Oh dear. Meat was a luxury, and it usually arrived slightly too close to the "is this edible" deadline. With no refrigeration, people relied heavily on spices, if they were rich, or sheer delusion if they weren't. If you've ever smelled chicken that's been in the trash for 2 days, congratulations, you've already smelled Medieval Tuesday. And don't think you can wash all this down with a refreshing glass of water. Absolutely not. Medieval water was basically a liquid curse. Contaminated rivers, sewage flowing everywhere, parasites having pool parties. Water would take you out before the meat did. So guess what everyone drank instead? Ale, beer, at every meal, including for children. But don't imagine medieval people being tipsy all day. It was a weak alcoholic brew meant to kill germs. Studies show the average peasant drank around 8 pints a day. Meanwhile, modern parents lose their minds if a kid sips iced tea. Fish? Also tricky. Unless you lived by the coast, the fish reaching your plate had traveled for days, sometimes weeks, preserved with salt so aggressively that chewing it felt like licking a mineral deposit. If your stomach isn't screaming yet, don't worry. We're just warming up the medieval experience. Bathrooms, or the total lack of them. Now that we've talked about medieval food, let's slide gracefully to the other side of digestion. Because yes, everyone ate, and everyone had to deal with the consequences. And the Middle Ages? Oh, honey, they were not built for consequences. Let's just set the scene. There are no bathrooms, no plumbing, no flushing, no tiles, no privacy. Honestly, no shame either, because if you lived back then, you simply didn't have the luxury of being embarrassed. Survival mode does not leave room for modesty. Most people use something called a chamber pot. Sounds cute, right? Victorian, romantic, maybe with flowers painted on the side? Nope. It was a bucket. A bucket that lived under your bed, warming itself nicely with you. You'd wake up, do your business, and then when the pot was full enough to threaten a mutiny, you'd carry it to the window. You'd open the shutters dramatically like a Disney princess, but instead of singing to birds, you'd throw raw human chaos onto the street. Of course, there was etiquette. Medieval courtesy was alive and well. Before unleashing your bucket of doom, you'd politely shout, "Gardy Lou," which basically meant, "Hey, move it unless you want a surprise shower that could permanently traumatize your sense of smell." Imagine walking down a narrow medieval street, flirting with a baker, living your best life, and suddenly someone's Tuesday morning lands on your shoulder. Yeah, streets went dirty. They were biological minefields with bonus sound effects. Now, if you are fancy, like I live in a castle and people call me my lord even though I haven't bathed in 6 months fancy, you might get to use a garter rope. This was essentially a wooden or stone seat with a hole carved out. That hole connected to a long vertical shaft built into the castle wall. You'd sit, think about life, and your waist would drop straight down the exterior wall or into a pit below. At Dover Castle, archaeologists found one that dropped nearly 70 feet. 70. That means a royal bottom could produce a royal scream echoing all the way down to the splash zone. And someone had to clean this nightmare.
Enter the gong farmers, heroes no one asked for. These men spent their nights climbing into cesspits, deep, horrifying, oxygen-deprived caverns filled with decades of accumulated human waste and scooping it out by hand. They were paid shockingly well because the job was basically signing up for a lifetime of horror. But there was a catch. The smell was so intense and so permanent that gong farmers were banned from public spaces. The stench clung to them like a curse. As for toilet paper, oh, sweet summer child, that did not exist. People used whatever they had around: moss, hay, wool, leaves, scraps of cloth, or, and this part probably altered history more than we admit, their left hand. This is exactly why the right hand became the clean, polite, socially acceptable hand. You greet with the right hand, you eat with the right hand. You never touch someone's left hand unless you're planning to fight them or you just made a very poor decision. And the smell, oh, the smell. Medieval towns didn't have sanitation systems. Waste from homes mixed with dung from livestock, rotting food, spilled beer, dead animals, and whatever the wind carried in. Imagine summer. Imagine heat. Imagine the aroma. So next time you're standing in line at Starbucks, irritated because someone ordered a 12-step latte that takes 6 minutes to make, just remember, at least you're not dodging airborne buckets of human disaster while trying to live your life.
Daily life, a never-ending work shift. Let's take a real look at what daily life meant for the average medieval person, because the more you understand it, the more your modern problems start looking like a spa weekend. If you feel exhausted after a 9-to-5 shift, a medieval peasant would stare at your workday like you were bragging about the softest, cushiest vacation ever created. Their entire routine was dictated by the sun, and sunrise to sunset wasn't poetic imagery, it was the literal length of their labor. Depending on the season, that meant 14 to 16 hours of non-stop physical work, often without proper food, without scheduled breaks, and without the concept of free time. After work, people didn't relax, didn't hang out, didn't scroll on their non-existent phones. They simply fell over from exhaustion, sometimes still in their work clothes, sometimes in the mud, and sometimes without even finishing dinner. Farmers lived in a world where everything they touched demanded physical strength. Their tools were wooden, crude, heavy, and completely unforgiving. The oxen that pulled plows were tired, underfed, and often injured. So whenever the animals couldn't continue, the humans had to fill in the gap with their own bodies. They lifted, dragged, pushed, pulled, and repeated these actions until their muscles trembled. During harvest season, time blurred into one long stretch of back-breaking labor. People worked until their hands blistered and reopened again, until sleep felt like a brief blink rather than a real rest. Modern studies show that an average medieval farm worker burned over 4,000 calories per day simply by trying to stay alive. That wasn't training for a marathon. That was survival, every single day.
And if you think life might have been easier in a trade, you'd be very wrong. Blacksmiths spent their days inhaling smoke and sparks, working inches away from burning metal that spit fire at their faces. Their lungs were constantly irritated. Their skin was burned, scarred, and perpetually coated in soot. Tanners worked with hides soaked in urine, literal vats of it, until the chemicals seeped into their skin and stained it yellow. Millers lived inside mills where flour dust floated like mist, coating every inhale and slowly suffocating their lungs. Children entered apprenticeships as young as 7, giving up childhood entirely. They worked 6, sometimes 7 days a week for over a decade to earn the right to call themselves a craftsman, and many never made it that far because the labor broke them first. Career counseling didn't exist, but if it had, the logic would have been brutally simple. The first question would have been, can you lift heavy things? If the answer was yes, congratulations, you were a farmer. If the answer was no, too bad, because you'd still have to lift them anyway. And if you truly couldn't lift anything at all, society didn't have a place for you. People with disabilities or chronic illnesses often faced a tragic and early death because the system simply had no space for anyone who couldn't contribute physically. Jobs that sound horrifying today were completely normal back then. Link boys, usually small children, walked the streets at night holding torches to guide the wealthy, breathing smoke and wandering alone through unsafe areas. Pure finders made their living collecting dog feces from the streets so leather workers could use it in tanning. Rat catchers hunted through dark alleys, basements, and medieval waste piles, catching enormous disease-carrying rats in environments so filthy, modern people would refuse to even look at them. Wages were just as bleak. A day laborer often earned only enough to buy a couple of loaves of bread. Poverty wasn't a fear, it was a daily reality. Minimum wage didn't exist, only survival wage did. People worked to keep themselves alive just long enough to work again the next day. Poor nutrition, endless labor, freezing winters, contaminated water, and the complete absence of real healthcare turned everyday life into a slow march towards exhaustion. When you put all of this together, it becomes painfully clear why the average life expectancy hovered between 30 and 40 years. Not because people didn't value life, but because life simply demanded more than human bodies could offer.
Medicine, or why you didn't want to get sick. Let's talk about medieval medicine, which is honestly one of the biggest reasons you prayed every single day not to get sick. Falling ill wasn't an inconvenience. It was practically a death sentence wrapped in wishful thinking. Medical knowledge was a confusing mixture of superstition, guesswork, and ideas borrowed from ancient texts that no one fully understood. Most doctors didn't actually study anatomy. They didn't know how the human body worked, they didn't know what germs were, and they certainly didn't understand disease. The average medieval physician believed illnesses came from imbalances in the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So every treatment revolved around trying to rebalance your insides based on theories that had no connection to reality. If you went to a doctor with a fever, they would probably tell you that your blood was too hot, and the logical solution in their mind was to drain it out of your body. Bloodletting was the go-to cure for nearly everything. Doctors used leeches or knives, and they removed so much blood that many patients fainted, worsened, or even died before the illness had a chance to run its course. If you had a cold, they might burn herbs next to your face to drive away evil vapors. If you had stomach pain, you might be prescribed a mixture of crushed worms, honey, and questionable herbs because someone somewhere wrote that it had worked one time. Even headaches were treated with remedies like drilling a tiny hole in your skull to release bad air, a practice known as trepanation, which was somehow considered reasonable. Hospitals were not places of healing the way we imagine today. They were more like shelters run by religious orders, where the goal was to care for your soul while your body suffered. Cleanliness was not a priority. Sheets were rarely washed, instruments were reused without cleaning, and infections spread like wildfire through wards filled with coughing, feverish patients. You didn't go to the hospital to get better. You went there to die comfortably, or at least die around people who could pray for you. Surgery was a nightmare of its own. Without anesthesia, every operation was performed on a patient who was fully awake, fully conscious, and fully aware of every cut. Surgeons didn't have formal medical training. Many were barbers, which is why the red and white barber pole originated as a symbol of blood and bandages. Imagine sitting in a wooden chair while someone who also cuts hair decides to amputate your leg using tools that look like they belong in a medieval torture chamber. The goal wasn't precision or safety, it was speed. The faster the surgeon worked, the more likely you were to survive shock, blood loss, and the agony of the procedure. Infection afterwards was almost guaranteed, and antibiotics didn't exist, so even a small cut could kill you slowly over days or weeks. Plague outbreaks turned everything into chaos. Diseases spread faster than knowledge, and entire towns watched people collapse in the streets with no understanding of what was happening. Doctors walked around wearing those long-beaked plague masks stuffed with herbs to filter the air, believing that disease traveled through bad smells called miasma. In reality, they were surrounded by fleas carrying bacteria they didn't know existed. People burned incense, rang bells, lit fires, and prayed desperately, but none of it stopped the spread. The death toll climbed so quickly that bodies were buried in mass graves, and entire villages disappeared from the map. Everyday injuries were just as dangerous. Something as small as a scratch could become infected and swell until the skin turned black and the pain became unbearable. A broken bone could leave you permanently disabled because no one knew how to set it properly. Women giving birth faced terrifying odds. Childbirth was one of the most common causes of death for young women because complications were common and medical help was primitive at best. The truth is simple. In the medieval world, getting sick was rarely about recovery. It was about endurance. You hoped your body was strong enough to fight whatever was happening, because medicine wasn't going to save you. It might even make things worse. Being healthy was less about good care and more about luck, genetics, and the willpower to survive in a world that didn't understand the very concept of disease.
Justice, chaotic, brutal, and completely unfair. Now imagine that, in the middle of all this exhausting labor, someone accuses you of a crime. Maybe you're innocent, maybe you aren't. But in the medieval world, innocence barely mattered. Laws shifted from one village to the next, written or unwritten, and the majority of people had no idea what the rules actually were. You didn't learn the law by reading it. You learned it when someone dragged you into court for breaking it. Trials were wildly illogical and terrifyingly unpredictable. One infamous method was the trial by hot iron. You were forced to pick up a burning iron bar and walk several steps. Afterwards, they bandaged your hand and waited to see how quickly it healed. If it healed cleanly, you were declared innocent. If not, you were guilty. It sounds ridiculous today because it was ridiculous then, and wounds in the Middle Ages rarely healed cleanly, especially when infection lurked everywhere. Another method was the trial by water. They tied you up and threw you into a river. If you sank, the logic claimed that the water, representing purity, had accepted you, and you were innocent, even if drowning killed you before they could pull you out. If you floated, the water rejected you, and you were guilty, which meant your execution was coming soon. It was a literal no-win scenario. Survive just long enough to be punished. Punishments were equally brutal. In England alone, more than 200 crimes carried the death penalty, including stealing something worth more than 12 pence. That's not even enough to buy a slice of bread today. Public executions became social gatherings. People brought their families, bought snacks, chatted with neighbors, and watched hangings as if they were part of the town's entertainment calendar. Torture was institutionalized. Tools like the rack, which tore your limbs apart, and thumbscrews, which crushed bone, were commonly used. The wheel twisted bodies into impossible angles, and interrogations, misleadingly called questions, involved ropes, stretching, tightening, and pain so extreme that people would confess to anything just to make it stop. But confessing didn't always protect you. In most cases, once a confession was extracted, execution simply followed more quickly. The system wasn't built to determine truth. It was built to end problems fast, often at the cost of entirely innocent lives.
Warfare, the final boss of misery. If everything else didn't get you, medieval warfare might. War wasn't an event, it was a lifestyle. The 100 Years' War stretched on for 116 years, meaning entire families lived and died without ever experiencing peace. Full plate armor? Only for the rich. A knight's armor cost about as much as a luxury car today. Most soldiers just wore padded gambesons and hoped for the best. Swords were pricey too, so regular fighters swung whatever they had, axes, spears, or repurposed farm tools. And then there were the longbows. These things were nightmares. They could punch through armor, but training for them warped the body. Lifelong archers developed enlarged shoulder bones from pulling 200-pound bows over and over. Battles were massacres disguised as strategy. At the Battle of Towton, around 28,000 men died in one day. Some never even made it to the fight. They froze to death waiting. If you survived, congrats. You still had to beat infection. A simple cut could kill you. Doctors had no antibiotics, just prayers and plants. Sieges were the bonus level of suffering. Being trapped by walls for months or even years meant starvation,
disease, and desperation. Chroniclers wrote about people eating rats, cats, dogs, and eventually each other. And armies didn't stop at the battlefield. They burned crops, looted homes, and terrorized civilians. Women and children suffered the most when soldiers came through. Living through a war didn't make you a hero. It just meant you had to get up at sunrise the next morning and keep surviving.
So the next time you wish you lived in some romantic medieval era, remember this. Unless you enjoy spoiled meat, hallucinogenic bread, 8 pints of breakfast beer, streets full of airborne human waste, 16-hour workdays, mercury medicine, trial by drowning, and wars that last longer than your entire life, medieval times would chew you up and spit you out. We aren't soft. We're just blessed. Every little comfort, from hot water to clean bread. And honestly, thank every star in the universe that we live now, not then. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. See you in the next one.